Welcome, everyone. This is the Dolby House, and this is actually our first program panel discussion for South by Southwest. And today, really, we're going to be talking about the future of immersive experiences with a bit of a focus towards audio. My name is Peter Michaelian. I lead our experience design practice here at Dolby, and we have an amazing group of panelists joining us today. From Frog Design, Valtech, and also Dolby. And just to run through the line to introduce, first we have Rich Holmes here, who is our Director of Product Strategy for Dolby I/O. Lindsey Harris, who's VP of Creative Experience at Valtech. David Hezlep, who's the Associate Director of Solutions Architecture at Frog. And Saegusa, who's the Director of Design Technology at Frog. So, great mix of folks here. Thinking about this group here and what they represent and their backgrounds. I think this is the mix of minds as we think about the future space and the types of creatives and technologists and sort of product creators that are really going to help shape the future of immersive experiences. And again, thinking about how audio plays a role. It feels like we're more and more conscious about that evolution and what's been changing, and makes you start to think about what does it mean to have a connected, immersive experience, and what does that start to look like in the future, right? So this presents challenges, it presents opportunities. What does it mean to communicate and interact, and how does audio interaction play a role in all of this? So I think to start off, just to get a general insight from the panel on how you see sort of the trends emerging in the sort of immersive experience, entertainment, and just general interactive space, especially when we think about Gen Z, what's important to them, which is maybe very different than what's important to all of us or how we interact with products and technologies. So let's start there and kick it off, and I'd like to hear what you guys think.
It's interesting to look at kind of the macro trend of immersive experiences and how they're starting to tap into kind of all the different aspects of life, everything from shopping to learning to transportation and even people's personal wellness. So I think it's really cool that we're starting to adopt this sort of multi-sensorial aesthetic that's kind of infusing into a lot of different elements of people's lives. So I think that's going to be an exciting opportunity for the future, but also for entertainment specifically, kind of the extension of storytelling and how that's kind of transcending the traditional format into things like virtual worlds and allowing for deeper exploration there.
Yeah, kind of building on top of that, one of the things I'm really excited about is spatial audio in terms of audio experiences, being able to map soundscape into the spaces. And then I think it was kind of a cool new tech type of thing 10 years ago maybe that existed, but now it kind of feels like it's starting to be becoming available to a general public to just test it out. So to your point, it could be used for, of course, entertainment, and it could be used for retails, or it could be used for any type of application that involves the spaces, right? So I think it's an exciting time to start thinking about those.
Yeah, from my perspective, what's really interesting is how the Gen Z are interacting in that space, the sort of social aspects of it, how they're spending large amounts of their time there, and how they're interacting. It's sort of I think the pandemic pushed them into that, but they've sort of fallen into it, and they continually to immerse themselves in it. I think most of the people in the audience aren't doing that. They were very much 2D. They're not spending their day-to-day walking around Roblox and interacting with people. But I think the next thing is how do you make it so that social interaction feels like a real social interaction rather than you just sat in front of a flat screen and back and forth. And that's really, because that's when you want to start spending the time there, and when you really want to look at the next level of immersion.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it sort of brings up it's a much more complex space for your brain to absorb and adapt to the different things that you're being exposed to. Meaning, we're sitting here right now and having this conversation. How your senses are picking up the people around you, or the side conversation, and what's happening here, which is the content. how does that start to, evolve in the virtual space where everything is on your head essentially in many cases, or very close to your head. So if you're taking in content but trying to have a conversation just as you would going to a concert, in person, what does that start to look like, virtually, and how do we sort of mimic those human connections that we create, and the reason we all kind of go to these types of events and want to have these experiences. So I think that comes to mind for me. I know I'm more supposed to ask the questions here, not give too much perspective, but can't help it.
Yeah, I think something to add to that is like the older generations, I think of technology and like virtual worlds as a little bit of escapism, like a distraction from real life, whereas younger generations are much more natural with using technology to actually kind of stimulate more genuine connection within these environments. And so there's definitely like a behavior of community building that's already naturally happening there.
Yeah, I think it's something to do with this literacy of having a good user experience is just improving so much in these 10 years almost. And then before then, technology was kind of like a pretty apparent, and it was something that we were as a technologists, like past, before Gen Z technologists, we were really excited about the technology and what technology can actually enable, and then start thinking about the experiences. But nowadays, experience that is out there is so profound and smooth. And then these younger folks probably don't even, think about or notice, or not having to think about those technologies that are underwater.
Right, and if it's not intuitive and easy to pick up, people are going to reject it.
Yeah.
That's right. Having it feel natural as we would absorb anything, in our ears and in our eyes, and having that happen digitally, I think that's the challenge to solve for, to enable that kind of like connection building that everyone's talking about here.
They're also true participants. They actually live in there, and they create in there, and they socialize. It's like that's a very different perspective to what we have in terms of like, oh, it's entertainment, it's something away from their life. This is intrinsically part of their life, and it's so important for them to socialize, and that's what human nature is, to socialize. So I think that's the real key.
Yeah, it's almost like as you said, it's more like world building than it is figuring out how to do a concert, or it's entertainment, or it's social media. It's like that really there's that larger problem at hand or thing to solve for, which is actually the human interface, and then there's the things that come with that, right? So I think that's really interesting to think about virtual worlds in that way. I was touching on it a little bit when I think about human perception and how we absorb, how we react to audio streams coming in, and how our brain takes that in, and it has a reaction, an emotional reaction or a connection. And maybe this is for you, Rich, just kind of start with, when we think about the audio space, what are some of the challenges or things that you see that, I know you do a lot of work in thinking about this, especially for, some of these next gen experiences.
Content creation is really challenging in this space. We're talking about the next generation, they sort of are creating in that space, but there's still this void between sort of fairly mundane creation and building blocks to deep immersive experiences, AAA gaming or something like that. There's a void between those two things, and I think that's one of the biggest problems I see. It's how do you create content for the general masses that is compelling and also is the next step of a rationale to be in that space? Because it can be a bit dry. I think there's a number of companies that have invested a lot of money in the immersive space, and you go around and it's not a wonderful space. And a lot of that is content. Some of it's people, but a lot of it is content. So how do we do that? And how do we bring some of the real life stuff into that space and sort of break down that barrier? Because it's not just about the social piece. It's also about how does the outside world come into that? Because there has to be a breakdown of that barrier.
Yeah, I think it's not just social, as you said, it's also productivity, right? I think that's also an angle which we've all been living, very much more closely over the last few years. And I think it's a glimpse. It's not, the whole virtual world and we're interacting as avatars, et cetera, but it is almost a precursor to that if you think about sitting in your, in your little box on the computer screen. And again, how does audio factor into that? If everyone's talking over each other, how is your brain perceiving the conversation? How are you able to react in a certain way? So I think, and to Kaz's point, the more separation and spatiality you start to build into the conversation, the way your brain picks up on those things perceptually, it's much clearer. You can react more, either a heightened reaction or more clearer reaction to those types of things. So I think there's also that angle to it when we think about like communications generally, if we were to generalize this kind of topic and how that sort of plays in as well. So one thing that I think we can probably spend a little bit or a lot of time discussing, and you mentioned it, Rich, is on the creator side of things. So maybe we're talking about more on the consumption side just now, but when you think about creating for those worlds, and when we say creator, I think it's important that we generalize that, and I think that as a descriptor has become, in a good way, I think, more and more generalized over the years in terms of how people define what a creator is. But as I think about even the work that we each do, or more artists and musicians and content creators, like what does this mean? What does this mean for them? Not just designing for the world, but also how you have to think about content creation and some of the things that, with the tools and the processes and things like that sort of start to come into play when we think about the future of content creation space.
I think it's a lot of fun, and it's just about thinking about how you start from a place of interactivity and spatial awareness. And it's no longer this kind of one-way conversation with guests of your experience, right? It's really how can we take people through a journey, and how can we respond to who they are, where they are, what they're doing, and kind of make that a more dynamic creative process.
What about how sort of automation, artificial intelligence start to come into play when it comes to content generation in general? What are your thoughts?
My perspective is I am a little skeptical as an outcome of the creative process. I don't know if a generative AI is there yet to just kind of please and then surprise people in a meaningful way. But in terms of as part of the process of creation, it can actually almost function as an enzyme to just kind of facilitate the creation process. For example, our Frog San Francisco industrial design team and a technologist team is kind of having a conversation about how to utilize these generative AIs in kind of a mood board session. It's a mood board that we kind of use as an inspiration for kind of a seed of the ideas. And then generally we kind of curate those inspirational assets from the internet and collect them and pin them. You're probably really familiar because you're ex-Frog. But it kind of in terms of injecting that into the process and then utilizing those generated AIs and just having some sort of objectivity and an X factor that didn't exist, because as soon as you're curating the mood board and as soon as you're curating inspirations by yourself, you're already kind of biased. But there's someone else, AI, the model is also speaking to you, and then that's kind of interesting area that we can explore, because and I was actually using the stable diffusion to generate some general prompts for I think the prompt I used was clean design chair or something like that, and it just generates a lot of beautiful these renderings, but some of them don't even have a seat to rest your butt. And that's kind of inspirational in a way that it's kind of presenting an opportunity that twisting something that you have perception is something that you can push for, right? So I think there's definitely an opportunity.
Yeah, and I think in terms of audio and discounting for a moment incidental and background audio effects and sounds and focusing specifically on music, I think, generative AI could be a very good tool in terms of, as Kaz mentioned, being able to cobble together ideas and make quick sketches. I think we're probably a ways out from getting to a place where it can actually generate content that people would want to listen to as music, right? Because there's so much human emotion embedded in music. And I think, we can get something that's very close, but we're still going to have this kind of uncanny valley of music that sounds almost there, but not quite. It'll get there eventually, I think, but it's a little further out there.
My core belief here is that some of the speaking specifically about music, is some of the best music has been done when creators take a tool that was meant for one thing and use it in a completely wrong way. And as they use it in the wrong way, it becomes the next step and the most amazing thing, and everybody thinks that it's revolutionary. And I think that's where it'll get used. It'll get used in this sort of the way that nobody thinks it is, like the chair with no seat. It's like, well, somebody will be like, well, it's not a chair, it's a helicopter, or it's something different. It's like,
exactly.
Oh. Yeah, and I don't think the AI will get that, the jump between those two things, but the human creator will do that. And I think that's where it's really valuable. It's like, oh, it's an idea. It's, like you said, it's an enzyme. It's just a spark. And then you can twist it and turn it and make a decision about it. And I think that's really the...
Yeah, and it's been like that for the human history, like Blue Note for jazz, for example. That's...
Hendrix guitar.
Totally,
like,
yeah.
Right.
You don't play guitar with your teeth, but somebody liked it.
And what was it? Was it Portishead that recorded all their music to vinyl and then destroyed the vinyl and sampled that?
There's a multitude of different places down the musical timeline where those things have happened, whether it's sampling, drum machines, guitars, piano, all those things have all the way through. So I'm specifically speaking about music, all the way up to where we are right now. And I think I know a number of musicians who have already been throwing their head into this, and they've been like, oh, this is amazing. And it hasn't been a threat. It's not a threat. I think it will be a threat in library music, in the sort of the stuff that sits behind sort of generic ads or things like that. And that actually is a lifeblood of a lot of musicians and creators, is those sort of day-to-day sort of what I call sausage factory type material, where it's not overly creative, but it sort of needs to be there. That's going to be a challenge, and that will be a twist in the economy of it. But I still, at that point, does that just make the actual creative process more valuable? Because everybody can have the other, democratizes the other stuff. So if you want actually creative material, it's going to cost you more because the person needs to live.
Yeah, I think those are all really interesting points. Thinking about, well, I don't know if you had the reaction to the question and the way you did, but Dolby, we're all about artistic intent. When you go downstairs and you listen to the song or you watch the film, it's about reproducing the vision of the creator. And I think this is where you start to get into this interesting territory where when you talk about democratization, well, what does that mean? As we said to start this point, everyone's a creator. You have a phone, you're a creator, So what, how does that creative element play out? You don't expect somebody to open up a session of Pro Tools every time they want to post a video or something like that, right? But so what is that? You think about automation and AI and democratization, how does that start to weave its way, and how does that intersect with, this notion of artistic intent? And as we think from, there's the tier one creators of the world, musicians and, filmmakers, et cetera, and then there's sort of the up-and-comers and more of the UGC and how that space has been evolving. So I don't know if there's any additional perspective on that, and if there's it's an interesting topic at Dolby, even, of how we think about that and think about what we create and the tools we build, and thinking about the future and our legacy and all those things. So it's a really interesting one to us. I don't have the full perspective or answer to that too, because I think it is kind of a balancing act.
I think we've been on that journey for 20 years. I don't think it's suddenly just because AI came out of the woodwork. There's been AI working in a lot of the Instagram filters and other places in a sort of more I don't know, hidden form, perhaps, where it hasn't been talking about ChatGPT and DALL-E and all the other things where everybody's like, it's taking over the world. They were just like, those have been assisting the creative process for what I would call non-professional creators for a long, long time. And whether that's going even further back, it's just like tools that allow people to do it more simply. I mean, Pro Tools was 30 years old, so that was a transition a long time ago, and we've been stepping down simpler and simpler and simpler tools all the way through. I don't think it's suddenly going to change overnight as much as everybody thinks it's the end of the world or whatever. I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're on a continuum. It's probably going to accelerate a little bit for the next few years, but then there'll be a plateau and then it'll be another acceleration. That's my personal take.
So still staying on the topic of creators for a moment, I think you might have mentioned something like this, Rich, but yes, we're referencing something like a Pro Tools, which is, audio mixing, et cetera, that we do. We sit on a computer, we do that with headphones or in a studio, and we kind of create a mix or with anything, right? We're creating something on a screen, we're 3D printing it or building that chair and prototyping it. But, again, where we started in the conversation in the virtual space, does that workflow, does that thought process of how you even launch into that, space of generating, does that change? Or are we still, doing what we're doing and then applying it into, an extended reality sort of, application?
It goes back to the content, like how much content are we going to have to create in this space? I think there's going to have to be the tools that do that. Are we going to be putting them in there? No, I think the tools are going to be built inside of those spaces because they have to be, because more and more of the generation that's going to be building those are already in those spaces. So as they become not, at the moment they're mainly participants. Yes, they're creating in the space, but they're not building tools in those spaces, I don't think, because they're not quite at the age where they're optimizing their life to make more, because they don't have some of them have a fiscal back on it, but most of them don't. So I think as they become the realization, similar to what happened in esports, it's like there's a bunch of people playing games and never thought they were going to make money out of it. It was never going to be the thing, and then all of a sudden it became the thing, and they could start making money, and then it became an industry. I think there's a generational thing where you'll have people in those environments, building in those environments, who grew up in those environments. And I think that's the transition.
Yeah, and I think that's where I see the exciting potential of AI playing a role too, is less in the determining the creative intent of the work, but in the personalization of then when it's alive. So being able to adapt and respond in an environment based on how people are using it. And obviously that would take a ton of content creation, a ton of human work to go in and manually do that. But if we kind of create these beautiful environments that allow creation and allow it to be adaptable and use AI to kind of power that piece of it, it can offload, the work and kind of allow that to exist.
What about I know maybe being a little audio-centric with some of the examples, but what about for just creative tools in general? You mentioned Kaz, using AI, but I'm thinking about, in the virtual space, in a virtual experience, how does that, as designers and developers, how do you use that as a creation tool versus just the output of the work? Have you thought about that, or have you seen examples out there where that's happening?
So some of the kind of platforms like virtual experiences, and then some spatial audio, and those kind of require some specific environment. That's one of the challenges that I see, it requires a VR goggle, or it requires some a specific space to just map those, if it's an immersive experience in an actual space, right? But just kind of leveraging an AI, at Frog, we kind of have been exploring this different distribution mechanism in a way of those immersive experiences, leveraging AI. So we have actually partnered with SF MoMA a few years back to create this immersive AR experience that you get to participate in a painting. And then that had a dedicated space in a museum. And then we use depth camera and then space for the calibration, very specific lightings, and then very specific configuration of the rooms. And that was like a technical constraint almost to make it happen. But few years after that, and then nowadays, like there is available like APIs from the TensorFlow that you can grab whatever, and then just convert these experiences into like a web page, and then you can actually start creating an environment that is like readily accessible to everybody, and then start to distributing those immersive experiences into like a literally not requiring any like buying gears or like setting up an environment or anything like that. So I think there's definitely, not only like content creation side of the AI, but also like there's like a technical capability itself will unlock those possibilities in the distribution method. So we've been exploring, so can't wait to share it.
I want to open it up to questions and have more of an interactive kind of conversation with the audience here. I think though, what might just to have a very general maybe perspective or last thought, call it, before opening it up of like, I think what we're all talking about when you think about like the future virtual experience, future of entertainment, what does that mean? And like there's not a very concise answer to any of that, right? But like there's these examples of things. And it's hard to predict, but we all see it kind of coming. I guess what would be interesting is hearing just your general, if you were to predict out into the future, what does that experience look like? How is it really going to be utilized versus it's just some novelty thing right now and, avatars running around, which is interesting, but what are the true applications that are going to like basically create this shift in how we interact and how we live and all of these other things that we're talking about in the future? Does that spark any thoughts for the group?
Maybe not like 30 years out, but I feel like the most realistic application of like a metaverse-like environment will be with audio, because people are already using like earbuds and their ears for a majority part of their day, and they're already digesting so much content in audio format. So I think once we like combine that with the modern technology and the spatial awareness piece, like how can you personalize people's experiences with audio as they go through the physical environments? And so it's a big leap to like assume that everybody's going to be in this virtual like visual world 100% of the day, but you can really imagine like having kind of a guide and like extra information in your ear like as you experience things. So I think I feel like that's going to be kind of the first step into the metaverse like experience.
I very much agree with that. And speaking strictly personally, I tend to be a little bit bearish on the concept of metaverse as this fully realized virtual world, simply because where we're at right now with the needs for headsets and all of this kind of augmentative technology, it's very, at the end of the day, isolating. You're kind of in your own little bubble, even though you're in this virtual world. And I think that hardware constraint's going to be a difficult hurdle to get over. We don't have that constraint so much with respect to audio because sound's all around us, right? And so as long as you can create kind of an immersive audio experience around somebody where the technology gets out of the way, and have more of, more of an augmented experience than a strictly virtual one. I think that's kind of where we're headed next, myself.
Even in this, as I'm processing the questions, you jump to as you said, the headset on the face, right? Like that's the physical thing that our minds associate when we think about virtual, but there's really, the broadest sense of the word means so much more. I think that's, as you're saying, like, the path to how this kind of unfolds in the future. It's more considering all of the other aspects of it versus it's the goggles on the face. So I think that's a good way to look at it and consider it.
Audio is one of those things that your brain is tuned to like really tune into like spatially. Video essentially is 2D. What you see is 2D. You can't see out the back of your head. I can hear stuff behind me. I know where everything is, and I know in a three-dimensional space where things are pretty effectively. That means that your brain is tuned into that way of thinking and the way of like perceiving the world. So you have to get that right. So one of the biggest failings actually in most of those metaverse experiences with the headset on is the audio is third class, so to speak, and that is actually very jarring because you do things like move your head around and it makes you feel like unbalanced because it's not tracking your inner ear correctly. It's not managing all of those experiences properly. Like your eyes are seeing movement, but your ears are not catching it out. So you have that sort of dissonance. Those things have got to get sorted, and they're getting sorted. I think it's a lot better than it has been for many years. But overlaying the additional pieces of audio, as you were saying, is super valuable, but it also allows you to bring other things that are not really close to you into view or into hearing range. So you can tune into or take things out of the real world. I mean, we're already in noise cancelling headphones, but what about selective noise cancelling headphones? What about, like, how do I select what I want to hear, but when somebody who I want to hear that I'm talking to, can do that? Can I do that in crowded rooms? Can I do this? All of those things are then sort of the next level. And then it's like, well, okay, so you're looking at this, and if there was some camera interaction, it knew where you are, there's additional information it can give you. We've got that with the voice assistants, but the voice assistants don't seem to be very closely connected to the level of AI that we're talking about here quite yet. So there's a lot more there. I think there's a join there. So there's multitude of different things we can do in audio. And when it comes to the hardware piece, I mean, AirPods are pretty amazing. Like, in terms of like putting them in your ear and you don't know that they're there pretty much, and they can add and take away. So it's not the same as this sort of like trash can on the front of your face.
Absolutely, yeah.
Let's turn it to the audience and have some questions. Yes.
I guess the setup to the question is, and you were sort of going there, Lindsey, in like the guided experience in your ear. We're seeing a lot of clinical trials for psychedelics and mental health, and I would just love to hear y'all's thoughts on like the role of sound and design and maybe where the future might go, and like healing. And not to mention that music brings us back to certain points in our life as well.
I think that's what got me into music in the first place. It's the when your hair sticks up on your arm when you hear a particular music, and or a particular song or whatever it is, that just gives you this sort of like emotional moment where you don't even know how you've come to this point. I think anything that's got that power to do that, and it happens where we don't even know why it's happening, must have much more power that's unleashable in those healing processes. Because if it can have that like visceral effect on you, like it's got to be. I don't think we've got even scraped the surface of what that can be at this point. I mean, there's a lot of thought on what those things are and like how certain things can affect you. But I think we're so much research away from that at this particular point. But I love that space because it's a non-invasive or generally non-invasive way of giving you a different way to deal with the world, because the world's getting increasingly more intense. And it's like, how do I calm myself? How do I put myself in this thing? And if I can do that without narcotics or alcohol or all of the other things that people are using at the moment, if I could put something in and it plays something to me for 10 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever, that's sign me up.
Immediately calls to mind a project I worked on years and years and years ago that was making an attempt to use audio to modulate emotional state. So if you were stressed, it might play sound that would bring you down a little bit, or if you were feeling a little bit sluggish, it might play sound to bring you up. And this was, maybe 12 years ago, using an EEG headset to read mental state, and then feeding that over into a digital audio workstation and piping that back out into generated music. And I'm just thinking about how much easier that would be to accomplish now, because that was really, really difficult at the time. And it's only going to get easier. And so I think there's some good opportunity for that. And then the other piece that immediately jumps to mind is, actually a project that was worked on maybe 5 or 6 years back at Frog about the effects of virtual reality on pain management in certain surgical procedures, such as skin grafting, and how dropping somebody into a virtual world really reduced the amount of pain medication necessary for those patients.
Yeah, and I think it's even cooler when we start to pair it with other wearable technologies. So like if you can monitor your heart rate and then immediately kind of a relaxing soundtrack kicks in to kind of modulate you, I think that you can use music to kind of, like you're saying, regulate against your reaction to the world. And that's a little bit more intuitive and less kind of intentional than trying to go into these virtual worlds to kind of seek that. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And like the guidance thing and the spatial awareness, like if you're riding your bike and being able to sense when there's like a car near you and using sound to kind of notify you when these things are about to happen. I think there's so many different implications into how it can provide value.
Audio is not just as a function. We really believe that it is tied to creating an emotion, and that's the reason this company, exists in many ways. We're true believers in that. And then what the technology does is, as we were starting the conversation, it actually allows your perceptual senses to be heightened as you absorb this content, whatever that is, a song, a film, a phone call from somebody, and how your brain is perceiving that, and the more detail, clarity, depth that you have in that piece of audio, the more you're going to respond to that versus it's a crummy, piece of audio, or you hear everyone's voices on top of each other. Whether it's the most eloquent thing that exists, you're not going to react in the same way, or at least it'll be much more delayed for your brain to catch up to what's happening. So I think it does. It's a good question, and it really ties to what I think we're all doing. We all try to do as creatives, but also and from the audio space and what we try to do here at Dolby as well.
We close eyes, but we don't really close ears, right? Because this is like audio is something that we're kind of consciously and subconsciously collecting information, and it just piles up. So can't really underestimate the impact of the information that they're accumulating over time.
Thinking about immersive experience, you talked about headset for hardware versus speaker. Do you see this as the future of immersive experience, being people wearing headset, versus being in a speaker environment? And do you see this technology scale up for group experiences, meaning a lot of people wearing headsets versus being in a multi-speaker environment?
There are going to be situations where people are in larger groups, and I think they've got headsets in, and we can create environments that you can't create in speaker environments as well. You can bring things outside of it. You can do unnatural things, which may be interesting, but I think speakers, even when you think about like taking headsets are light and they don't take a lot of things, but there's still something very freeing about just being in an environment and a sonic scape being around you. And I think with it's prevalence at this point of connected devices, so like connected speakers. I think some way to marshal multiple speakers in an environment and create those environments is really interesting. It's like, how do you make it with 7 smart speakers rather than necessarily having to create the MoMA install type thing? And how do those smart speakers know where they are with relation to each other? How do they manage that environment? And how do they manage where you are in that environment is something that I'm sure that Dolby's deep into. But I think that's the question. Is like it's always going to be a hybrid here. It's not going to be like, everybody's going to be like tuned in. But there will be situations where being tuned in gives you something that you can't create because it's so close coupled.
Yeah, I think having a headset on your head is just kind of like has an implication of having a controlled sound field, right? And then the speaker is definitely harder to do it, but I actually have a hobbyist kit that I actually bought in Japan that has an array of parametric speaker that's essentially kind of a laser beam of the sound, and it just kind of shoots a really like acute degree of the sound beam, and then only like this area of the people can actually hear those. So like speaking of the separation, that might be a possibility, and then mapping those soundscape into space even.
A lot of that beamforming technology has been around for a long time. I don't think anybody's effectively used it in in those type of environments. Yeah, I think there's a lot of compute that needs to happen if you're doing it with multiples and interaction with the environment. It works pretty well when you've got an array in front of you and you're just sort of there and they say, oh, it's moved around here, and that, like, great. It's a sort of a science project version of it, whereas like actually what that means in the real world is like it's a lot of understanding the environment and understanding the capabilities of those devices. So, but it just shows that I will never stop thinking about trying to work out how to do this type of stuff.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it makes us think too. Like, I think there's different problems to solve for each, but the headroom, call it, in headsets seems like there's a lot of greenfield there, meaning where we've been talking about today, well, how do you reproduce something that feels natural and interactive? And that's much harder to do on a headset. But there is a solution to that, you know, we're the company to be working on it, you know, but there's a solution there that doesn't really exist to make it feel natural. In the room environment, I think there's always room for advancement. You always think, well, how could there be more? Well, we put more, you know, speakers in this space, or the technology does, you know, XYZ things. What's next? There's always something next. But there's the physicality of that room, but then there's also the interactivity part, which I think that's like the new area versus it's just about content consumption. It's how you're consuming it and how you're interacting. So I think the headphones is an interesting one because they are getting closer and closer, as Rich said, to reproducing a room effect of when you know, that's part of the work that we've been doing is so when you're wearing headphones, you sometimes get lost as like, you know, is the sound coming from actually outside, which is great. That's what we want to have happen. How about one more question?
I'd be curious to hear everybody's perspectives on what the big barriers still are or friction points for consumers in experiencing audio and how you think that's going to change.
You know, walking around wearing AirPods, and I do it all the time myself, it's a very good specific use case, and I'm you know, certain we'll get to the point, as he was saying, about having a more of a spatial room effect in headsets. But it's also still a little bit isolating, so it's a little bit difficult to be social with those. I mean, you wear a headset, you know, even something as discreet as an earbud, and it's still a signal to the outside world saying, hey, don't approach me, right? So I think that's one of that kind of isolation effect is one of the hurdles we're going to have with those.
You touched on social. I think I said it about 15 times during this talk. Virtual worlds for me at this point, you cannot traverse around them and it feel like you're actually walking around a room talking to people. Like naturally, like as this disperses, there'll be groups of people that go off and talk individual things, and you'll hear one group, and then you may be triggered by a certain word that you hear, and then you want to go and gravitate to what those people are saying. In the virtual world, there's, I don't know, it feels like there's 2 or 3 people that are around you, and then they pop in and out, but it doesn't feel like you're conversing in a true environment where there's different conversations and you can traverse around them and interact with people and then pull away from them and those things. I think it's a difficult problem to solve because how wide of a group area do you cover? Is it 100 miles of things? Well, I think there's an obvious sort of like your hearing range is, I don't know, 100 foot or something like that, depending on the conditions. So as long as you can get all of those things and make it feel like there's communication and you can tune into those, but it's got to feel natural, because if it doesn't feel natural, your brain is really good at making it go, this is just, I don't feel like it's a proper place to be. And then it's like your hearing is the first thing to take you out of the immersion. You can say it's your eyesight or whatever, but you can be immersed with your eyes closed. You can't be immersed that well with you. I mean, if you didn't hear anything, back to your point, you always hear things. But if you put your fingers in your ears and just showed visuals, the immersion doesn't happen. It feels weird. So I think the social interaction thing is going to be a massive thing in audio, and how you bring in curated parts of additional audio into those. So whether it's like turn-by-turn navigation when you're on a bike or somebody's behind you, I don't want it to sound like Siri telling me that. It's like, I'd like it to be a little bit more personal. How do I make it feel more like a conversation with something that's not giving me instructions? I think that personal contact.
Thanks everyone for joining today. I know there's a lot of things going on at South by. Hopefully this is thought-provoking in your own worlds, whether it's audio-centric or just thinking about what's next on the horizon as you look at sort of where you're spending your time. I'd also like to thank the panelists for joining and participating. It's great conversation and nice mix of different perspectives. So really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.